Welcome to the MPA podcast.
The brand new podcast from the Abbey Road Music Photography Awards.
I'm Charlotte.
And I'm Katie, and we're both music photographers who've been working within the industry for over 10 years.
I've worked with artists including Sam Fender, Charlie XCX, and Clara.
And I've worked with artists including Two Door Cinema Club, Billie Eilish, and The Hunter.
In this week's episode, we aren't at Abbey Road, but instead at Love Supreme Festival.
Yes, we headed to East Sussex to sit down and speak with singer-songwriter and producer Joel Culpepper, who had just come off stage, and his go-to photographer, Michael Augustini.
Join us backstage to find out more on their collaborative process and creative approach to photography. We hope you enjoy it.
Hello. Hi, welcome. I'm Katie, and this is
I'm Charlotte.
and we're here backstage at Love Supreme Festival with the Abbey Road Music Photography Awards podcast. And yeah,
Michael Augustini.
Joel Culpepper.
Artist.
yeah, who's just come off the main stage. Incredible. It was epic.
Amazing.
And we wanted to talk a little bit today about the relationship between photographers and artists. So could you tell us a little bit about your story and how you started working together up to now, really? How you met? Yeah.
Do you want to go or should I?
Go first.
It was Kismet with Michael. My recollection is a festival. So it's nice that we're actually doing this interview at a festival because I think we met at a festival in Brighton.
Yeah, Brighton.
Okay, cool. So a festival in Brighton, Funk and Soul I think it was. And, I tend to collect people who are really good at what they do. When, you see someone that has an eye or an ear or, that adds to what it is that to what you do, you notice. And I noticed Michael and his skill set. He took some pictures for us for the show and sent them along. And I was like, these are amazing. Wow. And sometimes that chemistry between you, the artist, and the photographer, it's not always the case, You can get loads of photographers wrapped around the stage, but in terms of capturing the energy and just the kind of intention in the performance, I felt it through the lens. I felt it through the image, and that was my sort of recollection of how you and I started working together. I don't know what yours was, mate.
I know exactly the date and time when it happened because it was at that festival in Brighton, and festival starts and you have a tent which kicks off the music and there are a few people in there, and I was there with my brother and we came into the tent and there was one artist who was like kind of okay, took some pictures, went out, got some food, came back, and suddenly we came back and the tent was ramping with people, and there was this guy. I was like, wow, okay. So I was like, brother's like, hold my things and I'm just going to take some pictures. So I'm taking pictures and Joel is performing, I remember, in a tank top and going like it's giving everything. I was like, wow, okay. And it was amazing to photograph because even his guitarist soloing, it was a phenomenal experience. And I remember afterwards, we just sat down, had a pizza with my brother, and my brother was like, "Hey, that's the artist over there. You should go and chat to him." I was like, "Okay, fair enough." I was like, checked if I have my card on it. Came to Joe, was like, "Hey, I took some pictures of you. Here's my card, blah blah." And he was talking to someone, and that someone was like, "Yeah, you a photographer? Okay, take a picture of us." And I was like, okay. So I took that picture. That's why I know exactly when it happened. So it was in 2019, May. And I have that picture of those two guys. And it's like, okay. I was like, that would be a good timestamp of it. I think the collaboration went on because at that time I was doing a portrait project in my bedroom. So my studio in my bedroom, white wall, just couple of lights. And I remember I was telling Joel, like, if you want, come down and let's do some photos. And I did not expect him to message me back or anything like that. But he did, and he came down to my bedroom and we did a couple of photos. And that was that. And it took from there, yeah.
Joel, the first person that you toured with as well? Yeah. So how has the photography changed, do you find, now that you've worked with each other for so long? Is there ways that you've changed since you first started working together, or has it just kind of stayed the same? You guys were like a match made in photography artist heaven.
Yeah, because it was pretty instant.
Yeah, so I think initially it was the sort of live imagery in Michael capturing what we did on stage, but then I think it developed and grew into, okay, you know, I've got this project coming out, I've got, you know, this body of work I'm working on, or, you know, being in the studio, etc., and, you know, some conceptual ideas being spoken about between us. And, you know, I think the brilliant thing about working with Michael is his willingness to kind of go with whatever crazy idea I have, and his enthusiasm to try and match the idea or add, or just the general kind of like investment of time and energy. You know, you really feel that when collaborating, and it's something that I value, but it's also something that's rare, I think. You know, sometimes you're in a space, an industry where you know, things can be quite blasé. You cross paths with different people and it's like, okay, cool, yeah, we'll hang out, we'll create, blah, blah, blah. But I think Mike always felt genuine in his interest in what I'm doing. And it was a journey of, you know, collaboration in different projects, extending all the way to my album, which, you know, Michael took the image of. And, you know, we spoke about the concept, the themes are in and around it, what it needed to look like and feel like, and I can just sort of spew my kind of initial ideas, and he'll think how to make it happen, which is really great. You know, it's like I'm thinking of doing this, and there's no apprehension, there's no reservation in how's that going to work. You know, It's just like, it's like, yeah. Okay. So, yeah, let me think about this. And it's now trying to piece the, you know, as a puzzle piece, right? And trying to figure it out. And I love that, man. Like, how lucky am I?
I never thought about money when I was starting with photography, when we were collaborating, when we're talking about like how we collaborate with Joe. I have to say it's usually a day before or hours before he gives me a call and like, hey, do you have time? And I'm always yes, if I'm not, you know, like in this, but I'm always driven by the opportunity to work with Joel and with other artists as well. But our collaboration is sacred to me. You know, it's something that I have the opportunity to get my photography to next level, or the techniques I'm learning, I'm coming to Joel with, and Joel is like, yeah, great. Or we're in a shoot, and it's like, this is one concept, and I'll try 4 different ones, and then let's see what comes up with it, what comes up out of this. I feel like this relationship has moved me from, you know, here to there in terms of how I create, how I feel I can create. And I feel every time we do something together, it's like a missing piece. You know, it's like, yes, I have this idea of, I learned the technique of doing this and that, but then you need someone or the subject who would, you know, take that creativity to even the next level. And this is what I think we have together. It's like, it's that missing piece which puts the work to the next level, I think.
You're obviously a really creative match, which is amazing. We were saying it's really cool to see you on stage, because you could see almost you're almost telepathic. Like, he was getting ready to, just before Joel does them, and it's like, whoa, he's So we were wondering, do you plan that before, or is it just something that you guys have got to know each other so well and you're just ready? It's chemistry, yeah.
I'd say that's chemistry, and that's the beauty of working with Michael, is that you want to work with people that have instinct and, you know, are on the same vibration as you and can bounce off of what you're doing. And there's shots that I mean, there's points within a performance that I completely forget, you know, and it's only until Michael's shown me that, you know, it's all a bit of a daze. But, oh yeah, there was that moment where I looked straight into the camera. He was right there. It's almost like, just take some shots, bro. Which, you know, is kind of my, even though there is detail and loads of thought in and around the performance itself, but I think, you know, there's an organicness that I want to cut through as well. And it's like moments, yeah, there's a trust and there's, you know, a priority of what moment has happened here. And Michael's captured some of the best moments I've ever had on stage. So,
but I have to add to this, you know, there were moments that I missed as well, you know, so let's not, you know, we have the chemistry, but I do vividly remember one time with, was it Islington or somewhere, and I had to go and change my batteries. You know, it happens, right? Usually photographers have first 3 no flash. I always preach this to Joel, please open your show to everyone, and I do think everyone has the opportunity when shooting Joel's show. You could see other photographers today on a stage, and it's such a thing for those people who are taking pictures to have the opportunity and not to be restricted as much. But then when you're shooting the show, instead of doing 300 photos, you do 1,000 photos. Your batteries run out, and I went backstage to take my batteries, came back, and was like, nothing happened. I just missed a couple of moments. And then Joel was like, do you have that moment when I got to the crowd? And I was like, whoops. Well, I have different moments if you want, but I do remember that one. But it rarely happens. But the chemistry, I think it's also about observing what the artist is doing, feeling the music, feeling like if you have the opportunity to go on stage, it's like, when is the time? I was today, for example, thinking, it's like, okay, he might be doing some communication with the audience. That's the time when to capture the audience, right? That's why you're at the back. When he's doing dancing and hyping people up and he's in front, you need to be in front, right? It's kind of planning and seeing what the outcome should be. But I think that's, for me at least, came with experience and knowing, okay, we need a crowd shot, we need an action shot, we need a kind of portrait, or now I'm more focused on the behind the scenes things because I know it resonates more. It's more lifestyle-y. It's not the everyone can capture kind of thing, but it's more the backstage, the feel, the what was the story of the show, right? That's what I'm interested in capturing, I think, in the last couple of years.
Ask you about your equipment, because we saw that you were using lots of different cameras. And talk about your process between using different cameras.
So it has evolved, but my main gear is I have a DSLR with 2 lenses, 24-70, 70-200. That's kind of concert standard, I would say. But then I started using analog cameras more. I think Joe was putting like, hey, you should kind of explore. And over the years, and I didn't at the beginning. I was like, wow, why would I do analog photography if I have all these amazing emulations of analog, you know, like that I can put into digital, and it looks kind of that way. And yeah, I progressed to like, okay, let's try to experiment with analog photography as well. So today I had one camera that was just point and shoot, Olympus Mu analog, that can, you know, do the job. And also I have a small point and shoot Sony RX that I just recently acquired, and I was literally testing it out today and seeing how it works and what would work, because having those lenses and changing lenses and things like that, it's just kind of annoying, and those point and shoot cameras sometimes can be really less intimidating when you are in the backstage thing than a big lens that you pull out and people are like, oh my god, big lens. The smaller the camera, and not using also your phone. I'm trying not to use the phone. I'm doing videos on the phone, yes, but I'm trying to do more with those point and shoots. I have also SLR, which is, if you're interested, it's OM4 Ti. It's like a good SLR, James Bond advertising in there. And yeah, I feel like the results out of that are then, adding to the digital things. But it's also like, what if the analog fails? Always take the digital, so I'm trying to kind of, if I miss that moment, I have that moment and stuff like that. So I'm always trying to rotate, if you see what I mean.
And do you shoot more with analog together than, say, in your own personal work?
Analog came just, I think, a year and a half ago. We did one shoot for the press photos, all on analog, and there were also, I did digital as well, just in case it failed. But I think the results then come from the analog cameras are sometimes it's completely shit, but sometimes it's really good, and it's a moment, and you kind of give the value to the photo like in a slightly different way. And I'm sometimes catch myself in that, because is it a good photo, or is it a good photo because it's an analog photo? Yeah. Right? And you kind of need to do that. But what do you think, Joe? Like,
I think with the analog sort of conversation, and the reason why I, was encouraging you to explore it, I think stylistically, it's got a particular vibe, but I think similar to vinyl, similar to tape, it's about an energy that's on the actual image. And I think digital has absolutely its space and its purposes, and it can provide a real kind of fluid work rate, but when you see an analog photo, you kind of know it's analog, you kind of know that it's that specific moment. And I feel like, particularly with what my ambitions are within music, it's about the moments being captured. So I think the analog really supports those sort of ideas in regards to live and performance. So I'm really chuffed that amongst all of his other kit, an analog camera's amongst it. So yeah.
So what are the differences do you find between getting the best out of each other with live versus studio work? And is there one you prefer, or?
As I said, the difference is being allowed to be on stage. I'm not the kind of person that want to kind of show off and be on stage. I'm trying to hide as much as I can and take those moments and leave, and not to be, because I'm not the person who people came to see, right? So I'm trying to, even when I work with other artists, I'm trying to be off stage as much as I can. But I'll talk more about the studio thing, because it's really interesting that we work together in a way. I was thinking about it ages ago, that it's like Joel is an art director in our relationship, or the creator who comes like, okay, I have an idea, or he calls me, Mike, I got an idea. Do you have time tomorrow? And it's like, yes, okay, great, let's work on this. And then I'll bring all the gear.
Sorry, man.
No. I love this, because it's it's instant, and I bring all the gear. I'm in the middle of, I don't know, experimenting with a light leak camera. So I bring that on. Okay, I've ordered different types of film and stuff like that. So I'll bring all the gear to the shoot. He has an idea, and we work together, and then some things start happening during the shoot. In studio, many times we had shoots when we did not speak that much. Joe puts music on, or not even that, and we just shoot. And Joe usually is like, yeah, that's the shot, Mike. So we go through this, and I'm like a little bunny in my head. I was like, oh my god, this is amazing. But I was trying to be calm, and it's and there are different times where we shoot outside or something. So we need to find different locations, and 3 does not work very well, but the 4th one, it's the one, or we catch the good light or something like this. So it's all organic, I would say. But I would say that you are the kind of art director, and I'm bringing the production, cameras, and other things. Yeah.
Where do your ideas come from? Where do your ideas come from?
That's a good question. It can be birthed from, what I've seen, whether it be, I think I get a lot of inspiration from. It's almost like the conversations that I've had with different people. Something will stick out. Like if I'm talking to stylist Farad Noir over there, and he might say something like, we might have a conversation about, your movement on stage, and then that word might just stick with me for a minute, movement, and then it will prick up somewhere else. So like, okay, so with that word, what else does that word look like? How can I keep telling that story, which is a great way that Michael put it in terms of storytelling, and getting people to know who I am through these images, because I think there's a certain aesthetic and a call that can definitely, I sort of know how to try and access through watching music videos over the years and reading particular magazines and just sort of collecting these imagery and iconography over the years. But I think what moves beyond that is, what's the story? What is it that you're actually trying to say? What's the message? What is it that I want to convey to an audience that's, either with me already or potentially that catches their eye? So I think that informs some of the sort of creative ideas that I might put to Mike in what I'm wanting to do. The album cover in particular comes to mind in that I kind of wanted to stare directly into the camera, and I think that's very kind of exposing for me. I've always got shades on. I'm always, I know how I perform, but I think there's a vulnerability that's immediate when you can see the eyes. And, you have to trust the person that's behind the camera as well, because they're kind of, I feel like, it is like you're naked. You're kind of like, I'm kind of showing you and revealing a lot of yourself to this person. So for you to feel relaxed in that and kind of get a striking shot and being patient for it, waiting for it, I think all of those things have come in our collaboration. And those are the things that I think sort of I draw from to kind of, present to Mike.
It's always interesting for me to hear from the artists themselves, the musicians, what advice they would give to photographers going on tour, and like the practicalities of, touring life is so different to just being in studio photographer, for example. So do you have any advice for that, for being on stage? That could go to both of you.
Everyone's style is different, and there's no right or wrong because it's a creative thing. My 2 pence would be, wait for the moment. Wait for it. Be patient. It's going to come. And when you see it, just try your best to capture it, because it will translate. People will see it and be like, that's an amazing shot. But sometimes I think the danger is you trying to curate that to a point and force it. And it's like, put your hand there, go like this, and da-da-da. And we've all had those types of photo shoots where it's like, this is clunky. I'm a little bit uncomfortable. I'm a little bit. It shows in your body, and again, the energy on the image is not right. But if you just let that sort of drift, that moment to just reveal itself to you, and you're already there, which generally Michael is, I feel like that to me is an artist's dream with a photographer, because you kind of want a relaxed environment. You don't want it too choreographed. You want some kind of like outcomes potentially at the end, but essentially you just want, wait for the moment.
You were asking about tour photography, and I think it's very different to when you go just to one-off concert, because the challenge for photographers is the show is practically the same-ish, right? Like you have artists who change it a lot, but mostly you have some kind of a set of songs. You do the first show, you're excited, you capture the moments. You do the second show, you suddenly start feeling like, oh, how is it different to the first one? If we just swap the images, nobody knows if it's Liverpool or Leeds, right? So the challenge for the photographer is then to find those moments, how to differentiate it. If it's different green room, or if it's different what Joe is wearing or the artist is wearing, and it's all about details. I think it's focusing what are the details on stage. Does he if I know that he's gonna communicate with the audience in certain songs, or that he's gonna start dancing in a certain way, I'll be like, okay, so this time I'll capture it this way, this time I'll capture it that way. But I think it's very challenging, and I do admire photographers who go with huge bands who have set arena sets basically. And what do you do differently, right? Like, how do you capture that arena differently? Like, if it's Berlin or if it's London, you can't really tell, because you take that shot and you can put that was anywhere. But how do you differentiate it? What are the moments that make that gig special compared to the others? And I think that's the touring photography challenge that every photographer then, when they want to do that, they need to realize. And many that I heard that they are doing this, they have that challenge and they can burn out from it, because what do you do? You have the same thing over again. So
On the tour thing, I went on tours with lots of girls though, so it was like the clothes would change a lot and they would be like, yeah. But I really like the safety of the show being like pretty much the same, and then like you were saying, they're being able to like move around and get it from different angles and stuff, and you get to like perfect it and tell the story of the tour and tell the story of like the whole journey, instead of just having like one shot and being like, oh no, I went, because like if the next show with the battery dying, then you were like, we can get it.
I know I have the same experience though of touring with bands who have stage looks that wear the same stage looks every single night. So it is really interesting to hear you say, like, how do you differentiate and like get the different moments even from different angles and stuff. Finding those backstage seconds and letting things happen, and I suppose the backstage moments become more about telling the story of the tour, don't they? So it's a big one. We like to ask at the end of every podcast episode, what is the best advice that you ever received along the way in your career so far?
There's moments where I've been on stage and I can see 3 or 4 photographers sort of like, and I feel like there is a dance, literally, but there is a dance between the two of you. And if I was to give the advice to an artist, to someone that is capturing your set live, I would say engage with that photographer. Engage. I think, don't be scared, don't be afraid. You're gonna get an outcome that you both recognize is special. And there's been many sort of examples that are springing to my mind in regards to like their eyes, just you can feel it. It's like he's doing it. We're getting this, we're getting this moment between us, and they're always so gracious, messaging and saying, oh, I've taken this, I really like it, if you wanted to share it, da da da. So I think, encourage the relationship between you and the photographer. Don't shy away from it. Lean in.
Yeah, I would say that this was at the beginning of our kind of when I started taking pictures of the live shows. I noticed Joel notices me a lot there and does the things to the camera because, well, it's beneficial for both of us, right? Like you capture that moment, and there are some artists who are not comfortable with that. They don't want to see the photographers. They send them to the front of house. They don't want to engage with that. Fair enough. Like, I think it's part of their job to be photographed and to be like, okay, so you get the best images. I do get that people like to be captured only from one side and they restrict. I'm not going to name who these artists are, but there are restrictions. Yeah, definitely not Joe. But the artists who give you the show into your camera, Like, you are leaving happy that you got the shots. Sometimes you're like so panicked, your autofocus doesn't do the thing, and you're just like, but you capture the moment in any kind of way, and it's brilliant. So I think I second that. And the advice for photography I was given, and I still embrace and need to remind myself every time, is from a photographer called Sebastian Zanella. He doesn't shoot music. He shoots surf, skateboards, and stuff like that. But he taught me and repeated every time, it's all about details. Details, details, details. What is he wearing? What tattoos he has? What is the hand going up in the crowd? What are the movements that make the artist, right? Like, because you capture something in a still moment, but the artist is moving in a certain way, and it's maybe the hand goes up in a certain way, or the legs spread out, or something like that. It's interesting. I try to capture everybody's shoes this time, right? Like, what are they wearing, and what is because I know Joel takes care of all the details. What he's wearing, what tiniest to the tiniest detail, you know, and many artists do that way. There are some who come like black and black and don't care, but there are many artists who care about the single thing they are wearing, and that's our job to capture it. And that, I think, then makes your photography more interesting. People are close to it. Everybody who comes to the show does not have the close interaction with the artist that we get to have. So I think it's our job to capture it as in much detail as possible, and then also get the crowd shots and stuff like that. But that's in my mind, and in my career, I think the advice that I got from Sebastian was details, detail, details. And I always remind myself, looking at it, it's like, what is the detail that makes this moment? What are the things in there? So I would give that advice to others as well.
Well, thank you guys so much. It's been so great. It's so clear that you have such a great working relationship. I know, trying not to cry.
We will cry.
But it shows in the work, obviously, how such a match you guys are.
In person as well, it radiates.
Yeah.
You two together.
So it's been really great. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Enjoy the rest of the festival.
Enjoy the festival. Don't get blown away.
Thanks for joining us.
To find out more about this week's guest, head to the MPA Instagram or check out the show notes.
If you have any questions you'd like to ask us about music photography, email to mpa@abbeyroad.com and we'll get back to you. See you next time.